After having just taken off from Bogota, Colombia, a Boeing 747 freighter is struggling to climb after having suffered an engine failure at liftoff. This is literally the worst time for an engine failure, when the aircraft is incredibly heavy and close to the ground. Still, the pilots of the 747 manage to slowly climb to supposed safety, when suddenly a second engine starts to act up. Now, the 747 slowly starts descending back towards the ground below. Will the crew manage to fly their stricken aircraft to safety? Find out with me today in this episode, as we take a look at Centurion Air Cargo Flight 164. Welcome to airspace. In the morning hours of July 7, 2008, the two captains and one flight engineer of Centurion Air Cargo 164 were preparing their Boeing 747 for their flight from Bogota, Colombia to Miami. On board with them were also a first officer, two loadmasters, a mechanic and another flight engineer. Looking out their cockpit windows, they saw that cloudy weather prevailed around the airport, but that should pose no threat to the crew on that day. The aircraft used was a 747-200 freighter that was leased by Centurion Air. That meant that the flight was effectively operated by Colombia Air, a cargo airline from Michigan. The cargo of the day consisted mostly of flowers. As a standard element of every flight preparation, the crew now performed their takeoff briefing, which required special attention to the mountainous terrain surrounding the airport of Bogota. Due to this, an escape route had to be defined for the case that an engine failure should occur. Since the airport is situated at a high altitude of 2,600 meters, or roughly 8,600 feet where the air is not very dense, the crew also decided to immediately start dumping fuel in case of an engine failure. In that case, the aircraft would become lighter and they should be able to climb at a higher rate. At 3:55 in the morning, the crew of the 747 was ready for departure and given takeoff clearance. The 300-ton aircraft accelerated down the runway, and when it reached its takeoff speed, the captain started raising the nose of the huge airliner. But just as the 747 lifted off the ground, engine number 4, the rightmost engine, started to emit loud bangs and rapidly lost thrust. The crew also received a fire warning for that engine, so they quickly declared Mayday and requested to return to the airport immediately. Since Bogota is surrounded by high mountains, this task is easier said than done. A special return procedure has to be flown, which should bring the pilots safely back to the airport. The aviators immediately started this procedure and slowly climbed into the early morning dawn. Meanwhile, air traffic control cleared them to land on runway 13 right whenever they were ready. The captain also applied the maximum available power on all remaining engines, a so-called overboost condition. In this configuration, the engines provide more thrust than they are rated for, a condition which can usually be safely maintained for a few minutes only. But as the 747 turned right, back towards the airport, engine number 1, the leftmost engine, suddenly emitted a loud bang as well. It quickly lost thrust completely, just 20 seconds after the failure of engine number 4. Now, the three pilots of Centurion Flight 164 had to fly their very crippled bird with just two engines. In theory, their 747 should be able to maintain altitude or even climb very slowly, even with two engines inoperative. But the captain soon realized that this was not the case for them. They had only managed to climb to 750 feet above the ground, and now the massive plane was slowly descending towards the dark ground below. To lighten the aircraft, the crew immediately began dumping fuel as discussed, but to no avail. The 747 descended lower and lower, and now engine number 2 also started emitting loud bangs 5 times, but recovering each time. Frantic, the crew started looking for a place where they could put their aircraft down, but no good place was to be found. Finally, the 747 skimmed over trees and crash-landed in a field. It slid along it, broke up into several pieces, and finally hit a farmhouse. The captain's seat was the only one that had remained attached to the cockpit floor, but due to the high G-forces, he suffered a shattered disc in his spine. The second captain in the first officer's seat suffered a broken nose when he and his seat impacted the instrument panel. The mechanic and the flight engineer on the flight deck suffered the worst injuries and lost a lot of blood, while the remaining crew members walked away with just cuts and bruises. Still, the crew of the Boeing 747 was extremely lucky. A forced landing in a field usually offers little to no survivability. Sadly, the same can't be said for the occupants of the farmhouse. The farmer and his 13-year-old son perished when the huge aircraft barreled through their house. Soon after the accident, investigators arrived on the scene. They secured the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder and took a very close look at the engines of the wreckage. Eventually, all the parts of the aircraft were moved to a hangar for closer inspection. The investigators were especially interested in the engines of the 747. Why had they failed? A single engine failure is rare, but not unheard of, but multiple engine failures on a single aircraft are incredibly uncommon and usually have a common denominator, such as an encounter with volcanic ash or fuel starvation. I have videos on a few of these cases, I'll leave links to them in the description. When the investigators examined engine number 4, the first one that had failed, they quickly found the culprit. During the last overhaul of the engine, a turbine section of the engine was improperly fitted. This turbine section did not have the correct required diameter, which allowed for a suboptimal airflow through the engine. The problem was so bad that during takeoff, the airflow through the engine was disrupted, which resulted in a so-called surge. During such a surge, the internal pressure of the engine is not released through the back as intended, but forwards and backwards. This phenomenon is usually accompanied by loud bangs and streaks of flames being emitted from the engine. Sometimes the engine recovers from this, but sometimes it doesn't, like in this case. But what about the other engines? To reiterate, engine failures are pretty rare. The FAA estimates that one engine failure occurs for every 375,000 hours of jet engine operation. To put that in perspective, a pilot usually racks up about 20,000 flight hours during his or her career. If one assumes that a pilot flies two-engined aircraft all his life, that means that just about 10% of all pilots will experience a single-engine failure during their career. For four-engined aircraft, it's about every fifth pilot. Initially, the investigators must have suspected that the other engines too were affected by bad maintenance procedures. However, when they analyzed the other engines, they found no pre-existing defects or inconsistencies. Eventually, they were able to tell that engine number 1 had failed due to a failure of the low-pressure turbine, which resulted in the ejection of turbine parts through the back of the engine and subsequent destruction of itself. But the exact reason for the engine failure could not be determined. It is, however, noteworthy that at the time of the failure, an overboost condition existed and that the stress on the engine was tremendous. However, it should have been able to tolerate this temporary phase of immense demand. And what about engine number 2? Why had it surged 5 times? Investigators believed that this was due to the high pitch angle and the low speed of the aircraft. In that configuration, the engine could not draw air efficiently and was momentarily starved of air a few times, resulting in the compressor stalls that quickly resolved themselves. Eventually, the investigation was unable to find any connection between the failure of engine number 4 and engine number 1. Next, the investigation tried to determine why the Boeing 747 had been unable to maintain altitude with the two inoperative engines. It may be counterintuitive, but according to Boeing and also according to simulations conducted by the analysts, the airliner should have been able to maintain altitude even during a shallow turn. The accident aircraft, however, started descending slowly after the second engine failure. Several theories were tested. Maybe the performance problem stemmed from the fact that Bogota airport is situated at a high elevation. The air there is very thin and surely not conducive to achieving good climb performance. This theory, however, was discarded. The models used by Boeing and the investigation accounted for this altitude, and the climb should have been possible. The investigators also took a close look at the flying skills of the commander. He was faced with a very challenging situation and an aircraft that just would not climb. In that case, margins for error are almost non-existent, especially when it comes to flying at the correct airspeed. The captain, however, did not fly the correct speed exactly, resulting in several activations of the stick shaker. This stick shaker rattles the control column, which makes a lot of noise and is very noticeable by the pilots. It warns them that the aircraft is at very low speeds and about to stall. However, the pilots always quickly recovered from this and returned the aircraft to the correct speed regime. Still, the 747 descended instead of maintaining altitude. In the end, this mystery, like the one concerning the engines, could not be solved by the investigators. The entire accident seems to be a case of extremely bad luck and unforeseen circumstances. 2 independent engine failures on a single aircraft, that's all but unheard of. The crew of the 747 partially recovered from the crash. The second captain and the first officer were soon able to return to work, but the captain of the flight, the one that had been in the left seat, received injuries that left him partially immobilized. He now has to use a cane to walk and lost his job as a consequence. The flight engineer and the mechanic that traveled on the flight deck were even worse off. They are now confined to wheelchairs. Despite the tragedy that had occurred, involving the deaths of a farmer and his son, the small town of Madrid, where the crash had occurred, sent the captain a Medal of Valor in gratitude for avoiding the more populated areas. Eventually, the captain sued Boeing, Pratt & Whitney, who had manufactured the engines of the accidented aircraft, and Centurion Air Cargo. The allegations included that Boeing had failed to provide adequate operating instructions and warnings for the operations of the aircraft, particularly at high-altitude airports, and that Pratt & Whitney did not provide adequate guidance for maintenance and inspection of the JT9D engines that had failed on the accidented aircraft. Additionally, the action alleges that Centurion Air Cargo inadequately supervised the aircraft servicing at Bogota Airport on the day of the incident. In this lawsuit, the captain seeks compensation for his injuries and the subsequent loss of livelihood. If anyone finds the outcome of this lawsuit, let me know. I couldn't find anything but the initial filing. A pretty unbelievable story, if you ask me. The independent failure of 2 engines is so unlikely, and the fact that the pilot survived this makes the case even more unique. I hope you liked my account of this lesser-known story. If you did, leave a like for the almighty YouTube algorithm and consider subscribing. Thanks also to my Patreons on Patreon. Thanks to you, I can put even more work in these videos. If you too would like to support my channel, head over to Patreon to check out many cool benefits. That said, thank you, and see you all in the next one.